Maggie Callahan drove the shovel into frozen Kansas dirt with both hands because her arms had stopped shaking somewhere around the third hour, and she refused to stop until it was done. No preacher, no mourners, just her, the wind, and the man she'd loved for 14 months lying wrapped in his best shirt because it was the only thing she hadn't sold yet to pay the doctor who couldn't save him anyway. When the last of the soil settled flat, she picked up her travel bag and walked toward the one town in the territory where she knew absolutely no one was waiting for her. If this story moves you, stay until the very end and drop your city in the comments so I can see how far Maggie and Elias's story has traveled. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss what comes next. The train into Harlan Creek was 40 minutes late, which gave Maggie Callahan plenty of time to sit with her reflection in the dirty window glass and decide she looked exactly like what she was, a woman who had run out of options and was trying not to show it. She was 28 years old. She had 43 cents a carpet bag with 2 dresses and a hairbrush, her dead husband's pocket watch, because she couldn't bring herself to sell it, even when the coal bill came due, and a letter of introduction from Reverend Hayes of Kansas City that said she was a person of good character and considerable teaching ability. She planned to walk into the schoolhouse, present the letter, and be employed by end of day. That was the plan. The plan lasted exactly as long as it took her to find out the schoolhouse had burned down in September, and the town council hadn't yet agreed on whether to rebuild it. Burned how? Maggie asked the station master, a thin man named Gerald, who had the eyes of someone who delivered bad news for a living. Lamp knocked over during a meeting, Gerald said. Nobody hurt. But the council's been fighting over the rebuild money ever since. Half of them want to wait for railroad funding. Other half says if we take railroad money, we take railroad conditions. He shrugged. In the meantime, there's no school. And no position. No position, miss. Maggie stood on the platform and breathed through her nose the way her mother had taught her when she was 7 years old, and things felt like they were collapsing. In through the nose. Count 4. Out through the mouth. Count 4. Her mother had called it the widow's breath, which had seemed melodramatic at the time and now felt like prophecy. Is there a boarding house? She asked. Mrs. Aldrich on 2nd Street. $1.50 a week. She's fair, but she wants payment on arrival. Maggie had 43 cents. Thank you, she said, and picked up her bag. Harlan Creek was a town that had almost become something. You could see it in the architecture. The general store was solid brick, built with ambition. The hotel had 2 stories and a painted sign. There was a newspaper office, a telegraph station, a doctor's surgery with a real glass window. Someone had once believed this town was going somewhere. But the railroad had rerouted 2 years ago 3 miles south, and since then, Harlan Creek had the look of a man who'd been told the job was given to someone else. Still standing, still dressed for the occasion, not sure what to do with himself. Maggie walked the length of Main Street twice. She went into the general store and asked if they needed help. The woman behind the counter, broad-shouldered with kind eyes, looked at her carpet bag and her travel-worn dress and said they were fully staffed. She went to the hotel and asked about housekeeping work. The owner, a nervous man named Pitts, said his wife handled all of that, and his wife was particular. She went to the dressmaker, who had 2 daughters already working alongside her, and no room for a third pair of hands. At the saloon, she didn't even go inside. She stood at the door, and a man with a red face and a proprietary expression told her, before she could open her mouth, that they didn't need her kind of help, which was presumably a comment on her being respectable, and closed the door. By 3 in the afternoon, Maggie had 43 cents, no prospects, and the very specific kind of exhaustion that comes from being politely refused so many times that the politeness itself starts to feel like a weapon. She sat down on the bench outside the telegraph office and let herself think about Thomas. Not the way he looked at the end when the consumption had taken most of him and left a thin, fever-bright version behind. The way he looked on their wedding day, broad and laughing, and absolutely certain that Kansas City was only the beginning. He'd had plans. They'd both had plans. Plans had a way of dissolving in the face of a 2-year illness, and a doctor who charged by the visit, whether the visit helped or not. She wasn't angry at Thomas. She'd decided that early on during the first bad winter, when anger would have been easy and useless both. She was angry at the general state of things, at a world that handed women almost no tools for survival, and then expressed surprise when they struggled. But anger didn't pay the $1.50 that Mrs. Aldrich required on arrival. Maggie was still sitting with that thought when the street went quiet. It wasn't an immediate quiet. It moved down Main Street like a wave starting at the far northern end and rolling toward her. Conversations, dropping boot steps, pausing the ordinary noise of a Wednesday afternoon, simply stopping as if someone had put a hand over the town's mouth. She looked up. A man was riding down the center of the street on a dark bay horse that moved with the particular unhurried confidence of an animal that had never been frightened by anything. The rider matched the horse. He was tall even in the saddle, wearing a canvas coat the color of weathered wood. A dark hat pulled low against the afternoon glare. He rode with his reins in one hand and his other hand resting loose on his thigh nowhere near the revolver at his hip, which somehow made it more noticeable rather than less. "Lord have mercy," someone murmured behind Maggie. She turned her head. A woman in an apron was standing in the doorway of the bakery 2 doors down. Her arms crossed over her chest like she was holding herself together. "That's Elias Vane. Thought he'd stayed out on that property of his." "What's wrong with him?" Maggie asked. The woman looked at her the way people look at someone who's asked what's wrong with a rattlesnake. "He used to be Pinkerton," the woman said. "Detective. Spent 10 years finding people catching criminals doing whatever Alan Pinkerton told him to do. Then 3 years ago, he testified against the Consolidated Railroad Company in a federal hearing. Said they'd falsified evidence to get a land grant, that they'd used his reports to frame homesteaders who were standing in their way." She paused. Railroad had the case dismissed inside of a month. Vane lost his position. Company blacklisted him so he couldn't work for any agency from here to California. He bought 40 acres north of here with whatever savings he had, and he's been there ever since. "That doesn't sound like a reason to be afraid of him," Maggie said. "No," the woman agreed. "The reason to be afraid of him is that when the railroad's man here in town, that's Councilman Preston Cole, tried to have him run off the property on a manufactured vagrancy charge 2 years ago, Vane walked into the courthouse, put 300 pages of documented evidence on the judge's bench, and had Cole's deputy dismissed from office before sundown." She looked at Maggie. "He's the kind of man who doesn't get loud when he's angry. He just gets quiet and thorough, and somehow that's worse." The rider Vane had almost reached her position. Maggie could see his face now in the afternoon light. It wasn't a soft face. It was the face of a man who had spent considerable time outdoors and in difficult situations, all of which had left marks. Dark eyes that moved across the street with the steady automatic assessment of someone who'd been trained to notice everything and had never stopped. A jaw that looked like it had been set against something for a long time and hadn't relaxed since. The scar on his left arm was visible below the rolled cuff of his coat sleeve, a long pale line that disappeared toward his shoulder. He was looking at the street the way a man looks at a problem he's already solved and is waiting for everyone else to catch up. He was also looking directly at her. Maggie realized with a start that she was the only person on the street who hadn't retreated. The woman with the apron had stepped back into her doorway. The 2 men who'd been talking outside the telegraph office behind her had gone inside. Even old Gerald from the station had found somewhere else to be. It was just Maggie on the bench, and Elias Vane on his horse, and about 15 feet of dusty Kansas air between them. He drew even with her and stopped. The horse stood perfectly still. "You're new," he said. His voice was even, not loud, the kind of voice that didn't need to be. "Arrived this morning," Maggie said. She was annoyed at herself for the way her heart was hammering, because this was a man on a horse on a public street, and she had decided years ago not to be frightened of things simply because other people were. "Margaret Callahan." He studied her for a moment. Not rudely, it was more like the look of a man accustomed to reading people quickly and accurately. "You've been turned down for work," he said. It wasn't a question. "Twice this week and 4 times today," she said. "Do you know someone who's hiring?" Something shifted in his expression. Not humor exactly. More like the shadow of a thought crossing his face too quickly to name. "No," he said. "Then I suppose there's nothing further to discuss." Maggie picked up her carpet bag with both hands and stood. She didn't know where she was going. She was going anyway because sitting on a bench feeling sorry for herself had a limit, and she'd reached it. "Mrs. Callahan," she stopped. "The school board," Vane said. "They meet Thursday evenings at Ruth Haynes's store, 2nd and Main. If you want to make your case directly, that's where you make it." Maggie turned back. "The station master said they haven't agreed on funding." "They haven't. But they're also 3 months behind on deciding, and a qualified teacher showing up in person tends to move councils faster than letters of request." He paused. "Ruth Haynes is the swing vote. She's been arguing for rebuilding without railroad money. If you can demonstrate that you'll take the position on the town's existing salary rather than a railroad-subsidized rate, she'll bring the other two along." Maggie looked at him. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you asked a direct question, and it had a direct answer," he said. "And because this town needs a teacher considerably more than it needs another reason to feel helpless." He tapped the brim of his hat, once heeled the horse forward, and rode on down the street at the same unhurried pace as before. Maggie stood watching him go. Around her, the street slowly came back to life. Conversations, resuming bootsteps, resuming the ordinary noise returning like water filling a space. She noticed that no one came out to stand near her. No one asked what he'd said. They watched from their doorways with the particular expression of people who've decided in advance that curiosity is more dangerous than ignorance. She picked up her bag and walked to Ruth Haynes's general store. Ruth Haynes was 60 years old, built like a woman who'd been making her own decisions for 40 of those years, with white hair pinned severely back and eyes that were dark and direct and missed very little. She was alone in the store when Maggie walked in, tallying figures in a ledger with the focused attention of someone who enjoyed arithmetic. She looked up. She looked at the carpet bag. She looked at Maggie's face. "New," she said. "Teacher, by the look of that letter you're holding." Maggie put the letter of introduction on the counter. "Margaret Callahan. I was told you're on the school board." Ruth picked up the letter and read it. She read it the way people read things they intend to take seriously, slowly, twice. Then she set it down and looked at Maggie with the same directness. "Where'd you hear about the board meeting?" "Elias Vane told me." A pause. Something crossed Ruth's face, not quite surprise, but the look of someone recalibrating a calculation. "He spoke to you?" "Briefly. He told me you're the swing vote and that I should come directly." Ruth looked at her for another long moment. Then she said, "Sit down, Mrs. Callahan. Tell me what you can do and what you can't, and we'll talk about Thursday." They talked for nearly an hour. Maggie told her the truth that she'd taught at the Elm Street School in Kansas City for 4 years before her husband's illness, that she could handle any grade from 6-year-olds to 14-year-olds, that she had no illusions about frontier schoolrooms, and expected neither a full set of textbooks nor a working stove. Ruth asked sharp questions and listened to the answers with the focused attention she'd given the ledger. By the end, Maggie had a meeting on Thursday and a standing invitation to come by the store whenever she needed information about town. What she didn't have was a place to sleep. She walked back to Mrs. Aldrich's boarding house in the early evening with 43 cents and the knowledge that the school board meeting was 2 days away and she needed somewhere to be until then. Mrs. Aldrich came to the door in her apron and looked at Maggie's bag and her face and said nothing for a moment. $1.50, she said finally, on arrival. "I have 43 cents, Maggie said. "I have a school board meeting Thursday and a strong probability of employment. I'll pay you the full amount plus a week in advance the moment I'm paid." "Strong probability isn't $1.50. "No," Maggie agreed. "It isn't. But I'm a widow and a teacher, and I've been awake since 4 this morning, and I have nowhere else to go tonight, and I am asking you directly, woman to woman, for 2 days of credit." Mrs. Aldrich looked at her for a long moment. Her expression went through several things: suspicion, calculation, and finally something that looked like a decision made, despite better judgment. 2 days, she said. Not an hour more. And you do your own linens. Thank you, Maggie said, and meant it with everything she had. She was shown to a room on the second floor that was small and clean, with a window overlooking the alley. She set her bag on the bed, sat down beside it, and allowed herself exactly 3 minutes of feeling the full weight of everything Thomas in the frozen ground, the empty teaching position, the 43 cents, the long road between here and anything resembling stability. 3 minutes. Then she washed her face with the cold water in the basin, repinned her hair, and went downstairs to ask Mrs. Aldrich if she could earn her supper by helping with the washing up. She was in the kitchen, her hands deep in dishwater, when she heard Mrs. Aldrich say to someone in the front hallway, "New teacher, maybe. School board decides Thursday. Strange thing is, Vane's the one that pointed her our way." And the other voice, a man's voice careful and precise, said, "Is that so?" Maggie didn't recognize it, but she filed it away because she had spent 2 years managing a husband's illness on a teacher's salary. And one thing that experience had taught her was that information was the only currency that couldn't be taken from you. Thursday came with gray clouds and a cold wind that cut straight through Maggie's coat. She arrived at Ruth Haynes's store 15 minutes early because her mother had raised her to believe that being on time meant you were already late. Ruth was already there, along with 2 other council members, a thin, careful man named Dobbins, who owned the newspaper, and a round-faced farmer named Garrett, who smelled of hay and wore his good coat with the self-conscious formality of a man not accustomed to it. The 4th member of the board was the last to arrive. Preston Cole was 40 years old and had the handsome, smooth-featured look of a man who had always found it easy to make people trust him and had made considerable use of that fact. He wore a good suit, not ostentatious but clearly expensive. He shook hands with Dobbins and Garrett and nodded at Ruth, and then looked at Maggie with an expression of pleasant surprise that didn't reach his eyes. "Mrs. Callahan," he said, "I heard you were in town." "Preston Cole. I sit on the council." He paused. "I also represent the Consolidated Railroad Company's local interests. I imagine Ruth's told you about the funding question." "She has," Maggie said. "We have an offer on the table," Cole said, settling into the chair across from her with the ease of a man who expected chairs to accommodate him. The railroad would fully fund the rebuild and provide a supplementary teacher's salary for 3 years. Very generous arrangement. The condition is that the curriculum includes material about commercial development and the benefits of railroad expansion in the territory. He smiled pleasantly. Standard arrangement. Half the schools in Kansas have accepted it. "What happens after 3 years?" Maggie asked. Cole blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "The supplementary salary. What happens after 3 years when the railroad's funding period ends? Does the town resume full funding on its own, or does the railroad retain conditions on the curriculum indefinitely in exchange for continued support?" A silence. "Those details would be in the final contract," Cole said, and his pleasant voice hadn't changed, but something behind his eyes had. "Then I'd want to read the final contract before the board votes," Maggie said. "As would you all, I'd think." She looked at Ruth, then Dobbins, then Garrett. "What I'm offering is simple. I'll take the position at whatever salary the town can afford on its own budget, with no conditions on curriculum attached. Children should learn to read and cipher and think. They can make up their own minds about railroad expansion once they know how to think about it." Ruth Haynes made a sound that might have been approval. Cole looked at Maggie with the expression of a man recalibrating. "You're very confident for someone who arrived in town 2 days ago with no guarantee of employment." "I'm not confident," Maggie said. "I'm direct. There's a difference." The vote was 3-1. Dobbins and Garrett followed Ruth. Cole cast his opposing vote with his pleasant expression intact and his eyes flat and watchful. He shook hands with everyone afterward and told Maggie he looked forward to working with her, which was the kind of statement that could mean almost anything. Maggie walked back to Mrs. Aldrich's boarding house in the cold wind, employed, and almost lightheaded with relief. She had a position. She had a salary, small but real. She had 2 months before the schoolhouse would be ready, which meant she had time to find permanent lodgings and establish herself before the children arrived. She was turning over the details of this new and unexpected future when she nearly walked directly into Elias Vane. He was coming out of the telegraph office, a folded paper in his hand, and they both stopped with about a foot between them. Up close, she could see the lines around his eyes, not age exactly, more like the marks left by sustained watchfulness. His dark eyes went to her face and stayed there reading something. "The board voted," he said. "It was not a question." 3-1, Maggie said. Cole voted against. He would. Vane's jaw was set in a way that suggested thoughts he wasn't putting into words. He folded the telegraph paper twice more and put it in his coat pocket. "Congratulations, Mrs. Callahan." "Thank you for telling me about the meeting," she said. "I wouldn't have known to go. You'd have figured it out. Maybe, but 2 days slower." She looked at him directly, because she'd decided when she was still in Kansas City that she was done with the social habit of looking slightly away from men who made other people nervous. "Why does this town treat you the way it does? I've heard the railroad story. That doesn't explain the way people clear off the street." He looked at her for a long moment. The wind moved between them, cold and flat off the prairie. "Cole has spent 2 years telling this town I'm dangerous," he said finally. "That the testimony I gave was a personal grudge against the railroad. That I made up or distorted the evidence. That men who work against legitimate business interests are threats to the community's future." His voice was even the way a man's voice is even when he's worked hard to keep anger from showing through. Most people find it easier to believe the man in the good suit than the man who lives alone on 40 acres and doesn't come to town except when he needs supplies. "But you know the truth," Maggie said. "I know the truth," he said. "I have the truth. 300 pages of it. Doesn't do much good when the judge who dismissed the case is the same judge who handles any future filings. That can't be legal." A lot of things that aren't legal are also very difficult to prove to the satisfaction of a court that doesn't want to be convinced. Something moved through his expression, not defeat exactly, more like the exhaustion of someone who has been holding a heavy thing for a very long time and has gotten used to the weight without getting used to the burden. "Stay away from Cole," he said. "He'll be friendly and helpful, and you'll feel like you've made an ally. And then one day you'll do something that inconveniences him, and you'll find out exactly how friendly he was." "I've already inconvenienced him," Maggie said. Vane looked at her. "I asked to see the final contract before the vote," she said. He didn't expect that. His face did something interesting when I asked. Vane was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How long have you been a widow, Mrs. Callahan?" The question was unexpected, but not unkind. 7 months, Maggie said. "I'm sorry." "Thank you." She picked up her bag. "He was a good man. He would have liked Kansas." She paused. "He also would have told me I was being reckless taking a teaching position in a town where the most powerful man just voted against me in my first hour. But he also would have known I was going to do it anyway." The very corner of Vane's mouth moved. She couldn't be certain it was a smile. It was the possibility of a smile, the shadow of one gone, before it fully formed. "Good evening, Mrs. Callahan," he said. "Good evening, Mr. Vane." She walked back to Mrs. Aldrich's boarding house and paid the $1.50 with money borrowed against her first month's salary and lay down on the narrow bed with her arm across her eyes and let herself feel for just one moment the full strange precariousness of where she had landed. A town with no school yet and a powerful enemy made in the first hour. A job that wouldn't start for 2 months. A man the town was afraid of, who had, for reasons she didn't yet understand, decided she was worth giving directions to. She thought about what he'd said. 300 pages of truth that couldn't get a hearing. A man with the evidence and no venue to present it. a judge already in the railroad's corner. She was a teacher. She knew things about evidence and documentation and the kind of careful, methodical work that moved minds. She didn't know yet what she was going to do with that thought, but she filed it alongside everything else, and when she finally slept, she slept with the particular alertness of a woman who has learned to keep one ear open even at rest. Outside, Harlan Creek settled into its nighttime sounds. Somewhere on the north edge of town, the telegraph office window was still lit. And 40 acres out along the creek road, a lamp burned in a cabin window long past the hour when sensible people went to sleep. Neither Maggie Callahan nor Elias Vane were particularly sensible people. It was, she suspected, the most important thing they had in common. The school board's decision spread through Harlan Creek, the way all decisions spread through small towns faster than anyone intended, and with details added in transit that nobody had actually said. By Friday morning, Maggie heard 2 different versions of the meeting before she'd finished her breakfast at Mrs. Aldrich's table. In one version, she'd argued Cole into a corner so thoroughly that he'd nearly resigned his council seat. In the other, Cole had generously agreed to support her candidacy after she'd accepted certain conditions about curriculum. Neither version was accurate. Both told her something useful about the town. Ruth Haynes told her the straight version when Maggie stopped by the store that morning. "Cole's already been to see Dobbins," Ruth said, not looking up from the bolt of fabric she was measuring. "Told him you seemed like a capable woman, but possibly too independent-minded for a frontier schoolroom. Dobbins is soft. He'll second-guess his vote if Cole works on him long enough." "Can Cole reverse the decision?" "Needs a majority. He's got himself and needs one more." Ruth cut the fabric with a clean stroke. "Which means you need to be so clearly the right choice that changing the vote looks foolish. Best way to do that is to start working before there's a school to work in." "How?" Ruth finally looked up. 3 families in this town have children who haven't been in a classroom in over a year. The Garrett boy is 12 and can barely cipher. The Pemberton girls read at half their grade level. There's a family out on the Creek Road. The Okafor family came up from Texas 2 years ago. Their daughter Ada is 9 years old, and sharp as a tack, but nobody's taught her a thing since they left their last town. She folded the cut fabric with precise movements. You start working with those children now for no charge, and by the time the schoolhouse is ready, you've got 3 families who will defend your position to anyone who asks. Maggie thought about her 43 cents, which had become $1.12 after Mrs. Aldrich had paid her for 3 evenings of kitchen help. She thought about the 2 months before her salary began. She thought about Thomas, who had always said that the best investment was in the work itself and not the payment, and who had also died with $40 in debt, which somewhat complicated the philosophy. "All right," she said. "I'll start Monday." She started Saturday instead, because the Garrett boy, whose name was Henry, appeared at Mrs. Aldrich's door that afternoon with a note from his father asking if the new teacher had time for a pupil. She had him sitting at the kitchen table with a slate and a set of arithmetic problems within the hour. He was 12, sullen in the way of boys who've been told they're slow often enough to believe it, and he held the chalk like it had personally offended him. "How long since you were last in school?" Maggie asked. "September of last year," Henry said, "when the building burned." 14 months. What do you remember?" He shrugged. "Henry?" She said not unkindly but firmly. "A shrug is not an answer. It's a way of avoiding an answer. I'm not going to pretend I didn't see it, and I'm not going to let you pretend you gave me one. What do you remember?" He looked at her with the expression of a boy recalibrating his expectations of adults. "Addition and subtraction," he said. "Some multiplication. I have trouble with the big numbers." "Show me." He worked through 5 problems. He was slow, and his method was awkward, but he got 4 of them right, which was better than his expression suggested he expected. Maggie pointed at the correct ones without making a performance of it. "You're not slow," she said. "You learned a method that doesn't suit the way your mind works. We'll find a different method." Henry looked at her like she'd said something in a foreign language. Then he looked at his slate. Then he said, My pa says I probably won't need much arithmetic for farming anyway. Your pa is wrong, Maggie said, and I'll tell him so if you'd like. Farming requires more arithmetic than almost any profession I can name. Yield calculation, seed ratios, acreage measurement, market pricing. She paused. Unless you don't want to be a farmer. A longer pause. I want to build things, Henry said very quietly, like it was something he'd never said out loud. Bridges, maybe, or buildings. Then you'll need geometry and algebra and structural mathematics, Maggie said, which all start here. She tapped the slate. So let's not waste time. By the end of 2 hours, Henry had worked through 12 problems, gotten 10 right and left, with the slightly dazed expression of a boy who'd expected to feel stupid, and instead felt something else that he didn't have a name for yet. Maggie watched him go from Mrs. Aldrich's window and felt the specific satisfaction of teaching that she'd missed for 2 years, the moment when something opens in a child's face. The Okafor family lived on the Creek Road, and Maggie walked out on Sunday afternoon because Ruth had said Ada was sharp and she wanted to see for herself. The farmhouse was modest and well kept, and Ada's mother a careful woman named Delia, who watched Maggie with the particular alertness of someone who'd learned to assess strangers quickly. Let her in without warmth, but without hostility either. Ada was 9 years old, small and serious with her mother's watchful eyes. She sat across the kitchen table from Maggie and answered every question directly, and without fidgeting, which was more than most adults managed. "Can you read?" Maggie asked. "Yes, ma'am." "Show me." Delia put a Bible on the table. Ada opened it to the middle somewhere in Psalms and read 3 verses clearly and without stumbling. Her pronunciation was precise and her pace was measured. She wasn't rushing through to prove she could do it, she was actually reading. "How much have you had?" Maggie asked. "Schooling." 2 years in Galveston, Ada said. "Then we moved and there wasn't a school that would take me." She said it plainly without drama, but Maggie heard everything in it. She didn't look at Delia. She kept her eyes on Ada. "We're going to fix that," Maggie said. "Starting this week if your mother agrees." Delia said yes, but she said it the way a woman says yes when she's still deciding whether to trust the thing she's agreeing to. Maggie understood that too. She walked back to town in the late afternoon cold and thought about all the ways trust was a thing you had to earn before you could use it, and how that was true of classrooms, and of towns, and of most relationships worth having. She was halfway back when she heard a horse coming up behind her at a walk. She stepped to the side of the road without turning around, because she was a woman alone on a road outside town, and stepping aside first was just sensible, and the horse drew level with her and stopped. It was the dark bay. She recognized it before she looked up. "Mrs. Callahan," Elias Vane said. "Mr. Vane?" She looked up at him. He had the look of a man who'd been working there, was mud on his boots, and his coat was dusty, and he was carrying a roll of fence wire across the saddle behind him. "I've been to see the Okafor family." He nodded once. "Delia Okafor is a good woman. Careful." "She has reason to be careful." "Yes." His eyes moved down the road toward town, then back to her. "You're walking." "I don't have a horse." "It's 4 miles. "I'm aware," Maggie said. "I walked it on the way out." He looked at her for a moment with the assessing expression she was coming to recognize, the look of a man measuring a situation against what he knew and deciding what action, if any, the measurement required. Then he swung down from the horse with the economical movement of someone who'd done it 10,000 times and held the reins out toward her. "I'll walk," he said. "You ride." Maggie looked at the horse. She looked at Vane. "You have 4 miles of fence wire on that saddle." "I've walked 4 miles before." "Mr. Vane, I'm not taking your horse." "You're not taking it. I'm lending it." Something in his expression shifted, not quite impatience, more like a man who'd made a decision and wasn't interested in arguing around it. "The creek crossing is flooded from last night's rain. On foot, you'll either get wet to the knee or you'll have to go 2 miles around. On horseback, it's a non-issue. Maggie thought about her only pair of good boots. She thought about the 2 miles around. She thought about the dignity of refusing a practical offer on principle and decided it was a luxury she couldn't afford. "Thank you," she said, and let him help her up. He walked beside the horse and they went in silence for a while. The kind of silence that wasn't uncomfortable but wasn't entirely comfortable either. The silence of two people still in the process of determining what they were to each other. The prairie was flat and gray under the overcast sky, the grass pale with the last of winter, and the only sounds were the horses' hooves and the wind moving through what little remained of the tall grass at the road's edge. "Cole came to see Ruth Haynes this morning," Vane said without preamble. Maggie looked down at him. "She didn't mention it." "She might not know I know. I was in the back of the store when he came in. He didn't see me." Vane's jaw had the set to it she was learning to read as contained anger, not explosive, but pressurized, the kind that builds rather than releases. He made her an offer. If the school board reverses its decision and accepts railroad funding, the railroad will match whatever the town raises for the Creek Road repair. 2 for 1. Maggie absorbed this. "The Creek Road is bad. It's been bad for 2 years. 3 farmers can't get their grain to the rail station in wet season without losing a day to the mud. Ruth's been pushing the council to repair it since she found out the cost." He paused. "It's a good offer. Practical. 2 for 1 on road funding is real money. And all it costs is the school curriculum and my independence as a teacher." "And the precedent," Vane said. "Once the railroad funds one thing in this town with conditions attached, they fund everything with conditions attached. That's how it works. I've seen it in 6 counties." He said it without heat, just the flat weight of a man reciting a thing he'd learned at considerable personal cost. "Ruth will hold, but Dobbins will waver, and Garrett has that Creek Road problem." "What would you do?" Maggie asked. He was quiet for a moment. A bird called somewhere in the grass and went silent. "I'd find something Cole wants more than he wants the school," Vane said. "Something I could give him that costs me less than what he's taking. Make the trade on my terms instead of his." "What does he want?" "To not be exposed." Vane's voice was level. "He knows I have documentation of what the railroad did 3 years ago. He knows that if I ever find a venue to present it, a federal circuit judge who isn't compromised a newspaper editor outside the railroad's reach, his position here is finished. Everything he's built in this town on the back of Consolidated's money collapses." He paused. "He's been managing that threat carefully for 2 years, making sure I stay isolated, making sure nobody takes me seriously, making sure the story stays that I'm a bitter man with a grudge." "But you have 300 pages, Maggie said. "I have 300 pages that I can't get in front of anyone with the authority to act on them." The flatness in his voice now had a different quality, not defeat, but the particular exhaustion of someone who has held something heavy and precious for so long that they've stopped believing it will ever be put down. A newspaper would be enough. Not a local one. A city paper. Kansas City, Denver, Chicago. Someone with a readership Cole's employers actually care about. If a major paper runs the documentation, the railroad can't just have it dismissed. It becomes a public record. Maggie was quiet for a moment, thinking about something. About a thing Ruth Haynes had said on their first afternoon. About the newspaper editor Dobbins and his careful ways. "Dobbins went to school in Chicago," she said. "He mentioned it when we were introduced, said he trained at the Tribune." Vane stopped walking. Maggie pulled the horse up and looked back at him. He was standing in the road with an expression she hadn't seen on his face yet. The expression of a man who has just had a calculation change under him and is running the new numbers. "He still has contacts there," she said. "He'd have to. Men from the Tribune don't lose those connections." "Dobbins has been in Cole's pocket for 2 years, Vane said slowly. "He's been in Cole's pocket because Cole has something Dobbins wants," Maggie said. "But you just told me Cole offered Ruth a 2-for-1 match on Creek Road funding to reverse my vote, which means Cole is getting desperate enough to make offers." She looked at him steadily. Desperate men make mistakes. And a Tribune-trained editor who sees a story this size, a story about railroad fraud and falsified evidence and compromised courts, that's a story that would make a career. Even a career that's been sitting in Harlan Creek for 2 years. Vane stared at her. "You'd need a way in," he said finally. "Dobbins won't move if he thinks it puts him against Cole with nothing to gain." "I'm meeting with the full board Tuesday to discuss the schoolhouse timeline," Maggie said. "Dobbins will be there. If Cole makes another move before then, another offer, another pressure, I think Dobbins will show it on his face. He's not a man who's comfortable with what he's doing. You can see it." She paused. "I'll find the opening." Vane looked at her for a long moment. The wind moved between them. Behind her, the horse shifted its weight patiently. "You've been in this town 4 days," he said. "I have," Maggie said. "But I spent 2 years managing a situation I had no control over, and very limited resources, and no good options. It turns out that teaches you to look for leverage in places other people aren't looking." She met his eyes directly. "I'm not afraid of Cole. I watched my husband fight for 2 years against something he couldn't win, and he never once stopped being himself. The least I can do is the same." Something changed in Vane's face. It was subtle, a slight loosening around the eyes, the jaw releasing a fraction of its permanent tension. He'd had the look since she met him of a man who'd stopped expecting anything from the world except friction. This was the look of a man who'd just been surprised. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he reached up and took the reins from her and walked on, and she rode, and they covered the remaining distance to town in a silence that felt different from before. Less careful, less assessing, more like the silence of people who've said the important things and don't need to fill the space around them. At the edge of town, he helped her down with a hand that was matter-of-fact and impersonal, and she gave back the reins with a thank you that meant more than the words. And he nodded and swung back up and turned the horse north without ceremony. Maggie walked to Mrs. Aldrich's boarding house and sat on the edge of the bed and thought for a long time. She thought about the school and the Creek Road and Preston Cole and Dobbins and 300 pages of documentation sitting 40 acres up the road in a cabin where nobody important had bothered to look. She thought about Elias Vane's face when she'd said she wasn't afraid of Cole. The way something had shifted in it, not dramatically, not with any sentiment attached. Just a slight opening. The way a window looks when it's been closed so long the latch has rusted, and then someone lifts it from the right angle and it moves. She'd been a teacher long enough to know that look. It was the look of someone who'd stopped believing a thing was possible and had just been shown evidence that it might be wrong. She pulled her teaching ledger from the carpet bag and opened it to a fresh page and began writing down everything she knew about Preston Cole, about the school board, about Dobbins and his Chicago past and his uncomfortable eyes. She wrote down what Vane had told her and what she'd observed herself and what Ruth Haynes had said and what Henry Garrett's face had looked like when he got 10 out of 12 problems right. Thomas had always said she thought with a pencil in her hand. He'd said it like it was a gift which she'd thought was generous at the time and now understood was accurate. She thought better when she was writing. The connections appeared on paper that didn't appear in her head. She wrote until the lamp needed trimming, and by the time she stopped, she had 3 pages of notes and the beginning of something that felt cautiously and without any guarantees like a plan. Outside, the town settled into night. The wind had dropped. Somewhere down the street, a door closed, and voices murmured and went quiet. Harlan Creek was small enough that its nighttime silence was almost complete, broken only by the occasional passage of a horse and the distant sound of the creek running high from last night's rain. Maggie closed the ledger and set it on the nightstand and lay back on the narrow bed with her eyes open in the dark. She thought about what Vane had said, a major paper, a readership the railroad couldn't dismiss, a public record that couldn't be quietly buried by a compromised judge. She had a meeting Tuesday. She had a town full of people who were watching to see what she'd do. She had a man with 300 pages of truth and nowhere to put them. She had been in Harlan Creek 4 days, and she was already in deeper than she'd planned, and the thing was, she didn't mind. She'd spent 2 years feeling helpless in the face of something she couldn't change. This was different. This was something that could be changed if the right pieces moved in the right order, if the right people decided they were tired of the wrong arrangement. She closed her eyes. She thought of Thomas one more time, not with grief this time, but with something gentler. He would have had something practical and quietly wise to say about all of it. He always had. She'd have to figure it out on her own. She was getting better at that. The Tuesday board meeting was supposed to be about construction timelines. Maggie knew within the first 10 minutes that it was going to be about something else entirely. Cole arrived last, which she was beginning to understand was a deliberate habit, making every room wait for him long enough to feel the waiting. He set his hat on the table with the casual confidence of a man who considered furniture an extension of his authority, and looked around at Ruth, Dobbins, Garrett, and Maggie with the pleasant expression that never reached his eyes. "Before we get into the schoolhouse schedule," he said, settling into his chair, "I've had some news from the county seat that the board ought to hear." He pulled a folded document from his inside pocket and smoothed it on the table with 2 fingers. The Consolidated Railroad Company has revised its education partnership offer. In addition to the full rebuild funding and the 3-year salary supplement, they're now prepared to provide a complete set of McGuffey readers, a new stove, and a dedicated supply budget of $50 annually. He paused, letting the numbers sit in the room. For a town this size, that's a significant investment in the children's future. Garrett shifted in his chair. Maggie watched him without appearing to watch him the way he looked at the document, and then at Ruth, and then at his hands. He had 3 children. The oldest was the Pemberton girl's age. He was a good man. She'd decided who was tired of struggling for things that a better-funded situation would make easy. "The curriculum condition stands," Ruth asked. Her voice was neutral in the way of a woman who'd already made up her mind and was asking for the record. "A supplementary unit on commercial development," Cole said. 2 weeks out of the school year. Very reasonable. "And after 3 years," Maggie said. Cole turned his pleasant eyes toward her. "Mrs. Callahan, I'd hoped you might be more flexible now that you've had time to settle in and understand the town's situation." "I understand it well enough," Maggie said. "I asked about the contract terms after 3 years. You told me Thursday those details would be in the final contract. I'm asking again." "The terms would be renegotiated at that point," Cole said smoothly, "based on the partnership's success." "By whose measure of success?" Maggie asked. A silence. Dobbins was looking at the table. Garrett was looking at Cole. Ruth was looking at Maggie with something that might have been satisfaction. "The railroad's assessment would inform," Cole began, "so the railroad would evaluate its own partnership and determine whether its own terms had been met," Maggie said. "And if they decided they hadn't, the funding would end, and the town would be responsible for a teacher's salary it hadn't been budgeting for because the railroad was covering it." She looked at Garrett directly, because Garrett was the one she needed to reach. "Mr. Garrett, you farm. If someone offered to cover your seed costs for 3 years in exchange for 2 weeks of their choosing per harvest, and at the end of 3 years they alone decided whether the arrangement had been satisfactory, would you take that deal?" Garrett's mouth opened, then closed. He looked at Cole. "It's not quite the same," Cole said. "It's exactly the same." Ruth said, quiet and final. Cole's pleasant expression tightened at the edges very slightly, like the surface of something beginning to crack. He looked at Dobbins, who was still examining the table with the focused attention of a man trying to be invisible. "Edmund," Cole said, "you've been quiet." Dobbins looked up. He was a thin man with careful eyes and the permanently slightly hunched posture of someone who'd spent decades over a compositing desk. He had ink stains on his right hand that never fully washed out. When Cole said his name, something crossed Dobbins's face. Not fear exactly, but the look of a man who has been standing at a particular crossroads for a long time, and is very tired of standing there. "I think," Dobbins said slowly, "that we should table the funding discussion until we've seen the actual contract language." He paused. "In full, before we vote on anything." Cole looked at him for a moment. "Edmund, we've discussed?" "I know what we've discussed," Dobbins said, and his voice had a steadiness to it that Maggie suspected surprised even Dobbins himself. "I'm saying we should see the contract. That's all." The meeting ended without a vote. Cole gathered his document with the controlled movements of a man managing anger he couldn't afford to show, said his goodbyes with perfect courtesy, and left. Garrett followed quickly, looking like a man grateful to have escaped something he hadn't fully understood. Ruth watched them go, and then looked at Maggie with the direct assessment Maggie was coming to appreciate because it was always honest. "Dobbins is moving," Ruth said quietly. "He hasn't moved yet," Maggie said. "No, but he wants to." Ruth straightened the papers on the table with precise movements. "You should talk to him, tonight if you can, before Cole does." Maggie found Dobbins at the newspaper office an hour later, standing at his compositing desk with the focused stillness of a man not actually working. He looked up when she knocked on the open door and didn't look surprised, which told her he'd been expecting someone. "Mrs. Callahan," he said. "I won't take much of your time," Maggie said. She came inside and stood across the compositing desk from him and looked at him directly. The way she'd looked at Henry Garrett and Ada Okafor, like she was actually seeing him and not the version of him it was convenient for other people to believe in. "You trained at the Chicago Tribune." Something flickered in his eyes. "Long time ago. Do you still have contacts there?" A pause. Longer than a pause that meant nothing. "Some," he said carefully. "Why?" Maggie had thought about how to say this on the walk over. She'd decided the direct version was the only version that would work with a Tribune-trained man. Because Elias Vane has 300 pages of documented evidence of railroad fraud, falsified testimony, and compromised legal proceedings, and he can't get it in front of anyone with the authority to act on it, because every judge in the county has some connection to Consolidated. But a Chicago paper with a national readership is a different matter. She paused. "That's a story, Mr. Dobbins. A real one. The kind a Tribune editor would recognize." Dobbins was very still. He looked at the compositing desk. He looked at his ink-stained hands. He looked at Maggie with an expression that was complicated in ways she hadn't entirely expected. Not just calculation, but something that looked like a long-buried version of the man he'd been before he'd settled into the arrangement with Cole. "Cole would destroy this paper," he said quietly. "Cole is going to destroy this town either way," Maggie said. "That's what the railroad does. It comes in, it funds things, it makes itself necessary, and then it owns everything it funded. You've been here long enough to know that." She kept her voice even, not pressing, not persuading, just stating the way you state arithmetic to a student who already knows the answer and just needs to see it written down. "But if this story runs in Chicago Cole's position, here is finished before he can retaliate. That's the difference between acting now and waiting." Dobbins was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the wind moved down the empty street. A horse passed somewhere at the north end of town, its hooves faint on the frozen ground. "Vane would have to agree to it," Dobbins said finally. "I know," Maggie said. "I'll speak to him." She spoke to him the next morning. She rode out on the creek road on a horse she borrowed from Pete, who ran the livery, and who had looked at her with the particular expression of a man deciding whether to be surprised, and told Vane everything, while he stood in the doorway of his cabin with his coffee and listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for long enough that she started to believe he was going to say no. He looked out across the property, the fence line he'd been mending, the lean-to stable, the 40 acres he'd bought with the savings of 10 years of Pinkerton work, with the expression of a man measuring what he was willing to lose. "If it runs in Chicago and Cole can't stop it," he said finally, "the railroad pulls its money from this county. Every arrangement Cole's built on that money collapses. That's 2 council members, the county surveyor, and probably the circuit judge. He paused. It's also the Creek Road funding the hotel expansion and the new grain elevator that Garrett's been counting on. I know, Maggie said. This town might not thank me for it, Vane said, even if it's the right thing. This town has already not thanked you for 2 years, Maggie said. At least this way it has a reason that's actually true. He looked at her. She'd said it bluntly, more bluntly than she'd intended, and for a moment she thought she'd pushed too hard. Then something shifted in his face, not quite the shadow of a smile this time, but something in the same territory. You don't gentle things, he said. I'm a teacher. I've found that gentling things mostly just delays the moment when the student has to face the actual problem. She looked at him steadily. You've been waiting 3 years for the right venue. Dobbins is the venue. He's scared, but he's also tired of being scared, and that's a combination that moves people when you give them a clear enough reason. Vane set his coffee cup on the porch railing. He put both hands in his coat pockets and looked at the fence line again. I'll need 2 days to organize the documentation. Some of it needs context. It's technical surveying records and contract filings, and Dobbins will need to understand what he's looking at to explain it to an editor in Chicago. I can help with that, Maggie said. I spent 2 years managing medical records and billing disputes. Technical documentation doesn't intimidate me. He looked at her again, and this time the assessment was different from the first day she'd seen him on the street. Less the look of a man measuring a stranger, and more the look of a man trying to reconcile what he'd expected with what he kept finding. Come back Thursday, he said. Bring Dobbins if he'll come. She brought Dobbins on Thursday afternoon, and for 3 hours the 3 of them sat at Vane's kitchen table, with the documentation spread across it, and Vane walked them through it methodically. Survey records, contract amendments, sworn statements, correspondence that should never have existed in the form it did. Dobbins asked questions with the sharp, focused precision of a man who'd once been very good at this and was remembering it. His hands stopped shaking about halfway through the first hour. By the end, Dobbins sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling and said nothing for a full minute. I have a contact at the Tribune, he said finally. Man named Caldwell. He was 2 years ahead of me. He's been doing investigative work for 20 years, and he's been looking for a railroad story with this kind of documentation for at least 5. He paused. If I wire him with a summary tonight, he'll respond within 2 days. If he wants it, he'll send a reporter on the next train. Wire him, Vane said. Dobbins looked at him. He looked at the 300 pages of documentation stacked on the table. He looked at Maggie. He looked like a man stepping off a ledge he'd been standing on for 2 years, terrified, committed, and past the point of reconsidering. All right, he said. Cole came to Maggie 2 days later. He found her at Ruth's store on Saturday morning, where she was working with Ada Okafor and Henry Garrett at the back table while Ruth ran the counter. He came in quietly, looked at the children working, looked at Maggie, and waited with his hat in his hands and his pleasant expression in place until she finished the problem she was explaining. Then he said, "Could I have a word, Mrs. Callahan?" Ruth looked up from the counter. Maggie looked at Ruth. Ruth's expression was flat and watchful. Of course, Maggie said. She told the children to work the next 3 problems, and she'd check them when she returned, and she walked to the front of the store where Cole stood in the gray morning light, with his hat turning slowly in his hands. I'm going to be direct, Cole said. I'd appreciate that, Maggie said. I know you've been out to Vane's property, he said. I know Dobbins went with you Thursday. I don't know what was discussed, but I can make an educated guess. His pleasant voice had an undercurrent to it now, something she hadn't heard before. Not quite a threat, but the sound of a man who's decided that pleasantness has limits. Mrs. Callahan, you've been in this town 10 days. You have a teaching position that isn't fully secured, no permanent lodging, and no community standing yet. This is not the moment to make enemies. I haven't made any enemies, Maggie said. I've attended a board meeting and visited a few neighbors. Don't do that, Cole said. and for the first time the pleasant expression dropped entirely just for a moment, like a curtain blown aside by wind. "Don't be clever with me. I've been managing this county for 2 years. I know what a determined woman with nothing to lose looks like, and I'm looking at one." He paused, resettling the expression back into place, but it sat differently now, less convincing. "I'm offering you a way out of this that costs you nothing. The school gets built. You get your position. Nobody gets hurt. All you have to do is step away from whatever Vane has convinced you to do." "Vane hasn't convinced me to do anything," Maggie said. "I make my own decisions." "Then make a better one," Cole said. "I'm trying to." She kept her voice even, the way she kept her voice even with students who were frightened and covering it with anger. "Mr. Cole, I believe you think you're doing something good for this town. I believe you think railroad money and railroad conditions are a reasonable trade for growth and stability. But I've seen what happens when one entity controls too much of a community's future. I watched a hospital do it in Kansas City, and the patients were the last people anyone considered when the contracts came due." She looked at him steadily. "The children in this school deserve better than that. This town deserves better than that, and I think somewhere underneath everything you know it." Cole looked at her for a long moment. Something moved through his face. Something complicated that she couldn't fully read. A flicker of something that might have been uncertainty, or might have been anger, or might have been the brief shadow of a man who remembered a long time ago making a different kind of choice. Then it was gone, and the pleasant expression was back smooth and final. "I hope you know what you're doing," he said. "Not entirely," Maggie said honestly. "But I know why I'm doing it, and that's usually enough." Cole put his hat on and walked out. Ruth watched him go from behind the counter. The bell over the door rang and went still. "He knows," Ruth said quietly. "He suspects," Maggie said. "There's a difference. He doesn't know how far along it is." "How far along is it?" Maggie thought about Dobbins at his telegraph machine 2 nights ago, his hands steady, sending a message to a man in Chicago who'd spent 20 years looking for exactly this kind of story. She thought about Vane's documentation, 300 pages of truth that had been waiting 3 years for the right door to open. "Far enough," she said. Dobbins's contact wired back Friday. The reply was 6 words. "Send everything. Reporter arriving Tuesday morning." Dobbins brought the wire to Maggie at Mrs. Aldrich's that evening, his face pale with something that was equal parts terror and exhilaration. She read it twice and handed it back and said, "Good. Send Vane word tonight." "What if Cole finds out before Tuesday?" Dobbins asked. "Then we deal with that," Maggie said. "But Cole finding out before Tuesday means someone told him, and the only people who know are you, me, Vane, and Ruth. So we don't tell anyone else, and we don't change our routines, and we don't do anything that looks like what it is." Dobbins nodded. He looked at her with the expression she'd seen on students who'd just done something they'd thought was beyond them and hadn't fully processed it yet. "You're very calm," he said. "I'm not calm," Maggie said. "I'm managed. There's a difference." She thought of Thomas again, the particular way he'd faced every setback, not with false cheerfulness, but with a kind of deliberate steadiness, because panic helped nothing, and they'd learned that early and held to it through the long, dark years. "My husband taught me that you can feel everything you need to feel and still function. The feelings don't go away. You just put them somewhere that isn't in the way." Dobbins looked at her for a moment. Then he put his hat on and said, "Good night, Mrs. Callahan," and walked back out into the dark. Maggie went upstairs to her narrow room and sat on the edge of the bed and let herself feel everything she'd been managing all day. The conversation with Cole, the wire from Chicago, the Tuesday morning, that was 3 days away, and felt like standing on the near side of a river she'd never crossed, not knowing how deep it ran in the middle. She wasn't afraid. She was clear-eyed enough to know that Tuesday could go wrong in a dozen ways, that Cole had resources and connections she couldn't fully map, that a reporter from Chicago was not a guarantee of anything except that the story would be seen by someone with the power to care about it. But she thought about Vane's face across the kitchen table, Thursday, watching Dobbins read through the documentation with the careful, focused attention of a man rediscovering his purpose. She thought about the way Vane had looked at her when she'd asked him directly if he still had the strength to try one more time. Not with hope. Not yet hope was a thing you arrived at after not before. But with something she recognized because she'd felt it herself 7 months ago, standing in a frozen field with a shovel in her hands and the whole uncertain future stretched out ahead. The willingness to begin. She pulled out her teaching ledger and opened it and began writing, because she thought better with a pencil in her hand, and there was still planning to do, and 3 days was not very long, and the children needed her to get this right. Outside the prairie, dark was absolute and quiet. 40 acres up the creek road, a lamp burned late in a cabin window, and in the newspaper office on 2nd Street, Dobbins stood at his compositing desk with his ink-stained hands and looked at a cabinet he hadn't opened in 2 years, the one with his old Tribune press credentials and the notebook he'd used when he was 24 years old, and believed that stories mattered enough to risk things for. He opened the cabinet. He took out the notebook. He sat down and began to write. The Tribune reporter's name was Carter Hayes, and he arrived on the Tuesday morning train, looking exactly like what he was, a man who'd spent 20 years in newsrooms and considered sleep an optional luxury. He was 45, compact, with the kind of watchful stillness that reminded Maggie uncomfortably of Vane. He carried a leather satchel that clinked with the weight of notebooks and stepped off the platform, scanning the street with the automatic professional assessment of someone who'd walked into 100 unfamiliar towns and needed to understand them in the first 5 minutes. Dobbins met him at the station. Maggie watched from across the street because she and Dobbins had agreed the night before that her presence at the initial meeting would flag it too clearly. Cole had eyes in this town, not spies exactly, but the ordinary network of people who reported interesting things to the man with the most money, the way people in every small town reported interesting things to the most powerful person around. It was human nature. It wasn't malice. It was just the way things worked, and working around it required patience. She went back to Ruth's store and taught Henry Garrett and Ada Okafor for 2 hours, and kept her hands steady and her voice level, and thought of nothing except the problems on the slate and the children working them. Ruth brought her coffee at 11 and said quietly, without looking up from the counter, "Cole was at the telegraph office this morning. Early." Maggie kept her eyes on Ada's work. "How early?" "Gerald said before 7. That meant Cole had been watching the station yesterday, had seen the train come in, had seen Dobbins meet someone. Maybe hadn't gotten close enough to hear names. Maybe had. There was no way to know yet which version was true, and guessing wrong in either direction would cost her something. "Did Gerald say who he wired?" Maggie asked. "Gerald doesn't say anything about anybody's wires," Ruth said. "That's why people trust him with them." She paused. But Cole came out of that office looking like a man who'd solved a problem, which usually means he thinks he's ahead of something. Maggie set down her coffee and thought about that. Cole thinking he was ahead was different from Cole actually being ahead. The question was what action he'd take if he believed he had time versus what he'd do if he believed he was running out of it. She sent Henry and Ada home at noon with assignments and walked to the newspaper office. Carter Hayes was already there, his satchel open on Dobbins's spare desk, 3 notebooks arranged in a row beside it. He looked up when Maggie came in and waited. The way experienced journalists wait, without pressure, without performance. Just attentive stillness that made you want to fill it. Dobbins introduced her. Hayes said, "You're the teacher," with the flat declarative of a man who'd already been briefed and was confirming. "I am," Maggie said. "Did Edmund tell you the timeline situation?" "He did." Hayes picked up the top notebook and flipped to a page half covered in handwriting. "You have documentation dating back to February of 1880. Survey fraud on the Cimarron Valley land grant, false testimony to the Federal Land Office, and correspondence between Consolidated's regional manager and a circuit judge establishing a prior arrangement regarding any future litigation." He looked up. 300 pages. Vane has organized it, Maggie said. He can walk you through it today if you're ready. I was ready before I got on the train, Hayes said. He looked at her with the direct appraisal of a man calibrating how much to say. I've been looking for a case like this for 4 years. Every railroad story I've chased has had the same problem: plenty of evidence that something wrong happened. Not enough paper trail to prove who specifically ordered it and who specifically covered it up. What Vane apparently has is the paper trail. He paused. If the documentation is what Dobbins described, this doesn't just run in Chicago. This runs on the wire. Every major paper in the country picks it up within a week. Dobbins made a sound that was half satisfaction and half terror. There's a complication, Maggie said. Cole knows something is happening. He was at the telegraph office this morning before 7. He may have already wired Consolidated's people about your arrival. Hayes nodded, unsurprised. How long before he can get anyone here to apply pressure? Fastest train from the nearest Consolidated office is 8 hours, Dobbins said. That's if Cole wired last night. If he wired this morning, add the response time. Then we have today, Hayes said, and stood up and picked up his satchel. Take me to Vane. They rode out to the property together, Maggie, Dobbins, and Hayes, on horses borrowed from Pete's livery. Pete had looked at the three of them with his characteristic expression of a man who understood more than he let on, and had asked no questions. Maggie had thanked him, and he'd said, "Just bring my horses back in one piece," which she took as his version of good luck. Vane met them at the property line. He'd seen them coming from a distance she'd noticed before, that he positioned himself habitually so that nothing approached his land without him seeing it first. Which she now understood was less paranoia than professional habit, from a decade of work that required knowing your perimeter. He looked at Hayes with the assessment he gave everyone, quick and thorough, and whatever he concluded from it made him give a single nod that seemed to settle something. "You've read the summary," Vane said to Hayes. "Everything Dobbins could describe," Hayes said. "I need to see the originals." They worked for 4 hours at the kitchen table. Hayes asked questions the way a surgeon uses a scalpel. Precise, economical opening. Exactly the thing that needed opening and nothing more. Vane answered with the same economy, no elaboration, unless asked, no editorializing, just the facts in the order that made their significance clear. Maggie sat to one side and followed along in the documentation finding pages when Hayes needed them, organizing as they went, with the same focused attention she brought to a complex teaching problem. About 2 hours in, Hayes set down his pen and looked at Vane directly. "Why didn't you go to a newspaper 3 years ago?" he asked. Not accusatory, genuinely asking the way a journalist asks when he needs to understand the full story. Vane was quiet for a moment. He looked at the documentation spread across the table, 3 years of careful organization of evidence preserved and annotated of a man holding something in trust for a justice that hadn't arrived yet. "I tried," he said. "The Kansas City paper referred me to their legal counsel, who told them the story had too much litigation risk without a court ruling to support it. The Denver paper sat on it for 6 months and then said the same thing." He paused. "When the circuit judge dismissed the case that became the official record. A dismissed case looks to a cautious editor like a case that lacked merit, not like a case that was killed." "That's a reasonable editorial concern," Hayes said. "What changed?" Vane looked at Maggie. It was a brief look, not dramatic, not pointed. Just the honest direction of a man acknowledging a fact. "Someone showed me a different door," he said. Hayes looked at Maggie. Maggie looked at the documentation in her hands and kept her expression neutral, though something in her chest did a thing she elected not to examine too closely. Hayes went back to his notes. "I'll need a statement from you on the record," he said to Vane. "Your full account of the events, your role at Pinkerton, the moment you discovered the discrepancy, every step of what you did afterward. The documentation is the foundation, but the story needs a human being in it." "I know," Vane said. "I'll give you whatever you need." They were still working when the sound of a horse coming fast up the creek road reached the cabin. Vane was on his feet before anyone else registered what they'd heard. He moved to the window and looked out with the stillness of a man who'd spent years training himself not to show the first response, only the considered one. "Two riders," he said. "One of them is Cole." Dobbins went pale. Hayes picked up his satchel and said calmly, "Is there another way off this property?" "South fence line," Vane said. "Through the cottonwoods it comes out on the Miller Road." He looked at Hayes. "Everything you have, do you need the originals, or do your notes cover what you've seen?" "My notes cover it," Hayes said, "but originals are stronger." "Take them." Vane said it without hesitation. "All of it. Get it off the property." Maggie was already stacking documentation into Hayes's satchel with the systematic speed of a woman who'd spent years managing paperwork under pressure. Dobbins helped, his hands shaking slightly, but his movements accurate. Hayes took the satchel, nodded once at Vane, and went out the back with Dobbins behind him. The knock on the front door came as Maggie was closing the last of the empty documentation folders. She looked at Vane. He looked at her with a calm that wasn't the absence of tension, but the management of it, the face of a man who'd stood in difficult situations before, and knew that the quality of what happened in the next few minutes depended on not letting the difficulty show. "Sit down," he said quietly. "You're helping me with a property inventory. You've been here all afternoon." "That's almost true," Maggie said, and sat down at the table with an empty ledger open in front of her. Vane opened the door. Cole came in first with the manner of a man entering a space he's decided he owns. The second rider stayed outside, a large man Maggie didn't recognize, with the patient stance of someone employed for presence rather than conversation. Cole's pleasant expression was in place, but running thin like paint applied over something that didn't want to be covered. He looked at Maggie. Something moved through his eyes. Calculation, reassessment, the rapid adjustment of a man who'd expected one situation and found another. "Mrs. Callahan," he said. "I didn't realize you'd be here." "I've been helping Mr. Vane with some property records," Maggie said. She kept her voice the way she kept it in a classroom when a child was frightened and covering it badly, even unhurried, giving no purchase to panic. "Is there something we can help you with?" Cole looked around the kitchen. He looked at the table, at the open ledger, at the empty surface, where 300 pages of documentation had been spread 4 hours ago. His jaw tightened fractionally. "I heard you had a visitor from Chicago," Cole said, looking at Vane. "People come through town on the train sometimes," Vane said. "A Tribune reporter," Cole said. "Carter Hayes. I know who he is, Vane. I know why he's here." "Do you?" Vane said. It wasn't a question. He leaned against the wall beside the door with his arms loose at his sides. And there was something in his posture, the absolute absence of defensiveness, that Maggie recognized as a specific kind of strength. The strength of a man who has nothing left to hide. "Whatever you've given him," Cole said, and his voice had dropped the pleasantness entirely now. "It won't matter. I have legal counsel in Chicago, St. Louis, and Washington. If the Tribune runs anything based on documentation you've manufactured." "I didn't manufacture anything," Vane said. "Every page is an original. Survey records filed with the Federal Land Office. Contract amendments with Consolidated's own letterhead. Correspondence signed with names you'd recognize." He paused. "You can challenge the story. You have the money to slow it down. But you can't make the documents not exist, and you can't make Carter Hayes unsee what he's already seen." Cole looked at him. The pleasant face was gone. What was underneath it was not rage. Cole was not a man who operated in rage, but something colder. The face of a man recalculating a situation he'd believed was under control, and finding that the foundations had shifted while he was looking elsewhere. He looked at Maggie. "You did this," he said. Not accusing, stating. The voice of a man putting a fact in its correct place. "I pointed two people who already had everything they needed in the same direction," Maggie said. "That's all?" "You've been in this town 2 weeks." 11 days, Maggie said. "But I came from Kansas City, where the hospital board tried something very similar in 1879, and the Tribune ran that story too. She looked at him steadily. It's not a new strategy, Mr. Cole. It just works better when people are isolated enough not to know it's been tried before. Something shifted in Cole's face. The calculation was still there, still running, but underneath it, very briefly, in the way that real things surface, when the performance layer is under enough strain, there was something else. Not remorse exactly, but the look of a man who had made choices a long time ago that had led him here to a kitchen in Kansas on a November afternoon, and who was perhaps in some locked room inside himself, aware that the choices had cost him something he couldn't fully name. It was gone in a moment. He put his hat on and walked to the door. "This isn't finished," he said. "It isn't." Vane agreed. "But it's further along than you'd like, and the part you could have stopped was the part where Hayes got on the train in Chicago. That part is done." Cole walked out. The door closed. Outside, hooves retreated down the creek road at a controlled pace, a man riding fast enough to be somewhere quickly, but not so fast as to look like fleeing. Maggie and Vane stood in the kitchen, and neither of them spoke for a moment. The afternoon light was going gray through the window. The fire in the stove had burned low. Outside, the prairie was still and quiet and enormous, in the way that only the Kansas prairie is enormous, stretching away in every direction without apology. "He'll go after Dobbins," Vane said. "Dobbins is with Hayes," Maggie said, "and Hayes has the documentation." She paused. "Cole can threaten the paper. He can threaten Dobbins's business. But Hayes doesn't work for anyone in this county, and the Tribune doesn't need Consolidated's goodwill. Once Hayes wires the story, the threat against Dobbins becomes retaliation against a press witness, which is a worse story than the original one." Vane looked at her. "You thought all of that through." "I thought it through Thursday night," Maggie said. "And again Friday. And Saturday morning." She allowed herself briefly to lean back against the table edge and feel the exhaustion she'd been managing all day. "I'm a teacher. We do most of our work before the lesson and try to look calm during it." Vane was quiet for a moment. He moved to the stove and added wood with practiced movements, and the fire took hold again, and the light in the kitchen shifted from gray to warm. Maggie watched him and thought about the things she knew about him, now that she hadn't known 11 days ago about the Pinkerton years and the testimony and the 3 years of isolation and the 300 pages he'd kept organized and annotated in the hope that someday there would be a door worth opening. "You gave Hayes everything," she said. "You didn't keep a copy." "I have copies," he said. "At a bank in Abilene sealed deposit. I put them there the second year when I realized this was going to take longer than I'd thought." He paused. "But giving Hayes the originals, that felt different. That felt like letting go of something." "Was that hard?" Maggie asked. He considered the question with the seriousness he gave everything. "Yes," he said, "and also easier than I expected." He looked at her. "I've been holding that documentation like it was the only solid thing, like as long as I had it in my hands there was still a chance. Letting someone else carry it." He stopped. "Means trusting that someone else will do what's right with it," Maggie said. "Yes. Is that hard for you?" He looked at her for a long moment, and she had the sense, not for the first time, that he was answering a question more carefully than its surface required, that the question had layers he was choosing to respond to honestly. "It used to be easier," he said. 10 years ago, I trusted the Pinkerton organization completely. Believed in the work, believed in the institution. And then I found out the institution had sent me to do things whose purpose was not what I'd been told." He picked up the empty coffee cup from that morning and looked at it like he'd forgotten it was there. When the foundation shifts like that, it's hard to know what to stand on afterward. Maggie thought about Thomas in the last year when the illness had stripped away everything that wasn't essential, and what was left was just the two of them in a small apartment in Kansas City with very little money and the specific honesty that comes when there's nothing left to perform for. She thought about what he'd said one evening 3 weeks before the end, when she'd been sitting beside his bed, and he'd been looking at the ceiling with the clear-eyed equanimity he'd arrived at, and she hadn't yet. He'd said, "The foundation doesn't shift, Maggie. You think it does, but it doesn't. You're just finally seeing what it was always made of." She hadn't understood it fully then. She was beginning to now. "You stand on the thing that was true before the institution," she said. "The reason you did the work in the first place. Before Pinkerton, before the organization, what made you want to do it?" Vane was still for a moment. "People were being hurt who shouldn't have been," he said slowly. "And no one with the authority to stop it was doing anything." "That's still true," Maggie said. "That hasn't changed." He looked at her. Outside, the wind moved across the prairie, and the cottonwoods along the fence line stirred and went still. The fire had taken hold fully now, and the kitchen was warm, and the light was the particular amber of a late autumn afternoon that knew it was the last of the warm hours before dark. "You should stay for supper," he said. "It's 4 miles back to town, and it'll be dark in an hour." It was the most ordinary thing he'd said to her since they'd met, and it landed with a weight that the ordinary things sometimes carry when they're said at the right moment. "All right," Maggie said. She helped with the cooking she'd learned to ask what needed doing and do it without fuss, and he'd learned to accept help without making ceremony of it, and they worked in the kitchen with the easy quiet of people who'd found a rhythm without discussing it. She thought about what Ruth had said the first day that Vane had been alone too long. She understood now what Ruth meant. Not that he was broken by it, he was far from broken, but that there was a quality to his interactions with her that suggested he'd forgotten somewhere in 3 years of solitary living that things could be easy. That another person in the same room could feel like addition rather than subtraction. Over supper, he told her about the Okafor family that Delia's husband Jonas had filed a homestead claim 3 years ago, and Cole's surveyor had twice challenged the boundaries, and that the challenge had nothing to do with the actual survey lines and everything to do with a water access point that Consolidated wanted for a future depot. He told her matter-of-factly the way he told everything, but she heard the anger underneath it, quiet and pressurized, and 3 years old. "Did you help them?" Maggie asked. "I filed a counter-survey," Vane said. "Paid for it myself. The challenge hasn't gone anywhere since, but Cole hasn't dropped it either." "That's why Delia is careful," Maggie said. "Not just because the town is uncertain about you, because you've put yourself between her family and Cole before, and she knows what that costs." Vane looked at her. "Yes." "She'll trust you eventually," Maggie said. "Trust like hers takes time to build, but it's the kind that doesn't break." She paused. "Ada talks about her father with the same care Delia has. The whole family is like that. They only put weight on things they've tested first." "That's sensible," Vane said. "It is," Maggie agreed. "I'm trying to be more like it, actually. I have a habit of deciding quickly and trusting my first reading of people." She smiled slightly. "It's served me well enough here, but I know it's not always reliable." "Your first reading of Cole was accurate," Vane said. "My first reading of you was that you were interesting and probably honest and possibly dangerous," Maggie said. He looked at her across the table. 2 out of 3, she said. The corner of his mouth moved the same almost movement she'd seen before, the shadow of something that wanted to be a smile. This time, it went a little further than before. Not quite there, but closer. "The reporter will wire from Abilene tomorrow," Vane said, returning to the practical in the way that was characteristic of him. "If Hayes does what Dobbins says he'll do, the story goes to Chicago within 48 hours. Cole will know it's coming, but knowing it's coming doesn't stop it." He paused. "After it runs, the county arrangement changes. Cole loses the railroad backing that's been protecting him. What happens to this town after that depends on what the town decides to do with the space." "The town will be angry at first," Maggie said. "At you. At me. At Dobbins. The Creek Road money disappears. The hotel expansion disappears. People had plans built on that railroad backing. I know, Vane said. And then they'll have to make different plans. Plans that belong to them. She looked at him steadily. That's harder in the short run. It's better in the long run. But the people bearing the cost of the short run are real people with real problems, and we have to know that going in. I've known it for 3 years, Vane said quietly. It's the reason I waited, trying to find a way to do it that didn't blow the whole foundation out from under people who'd done nothing wrong. He paused. There wasn't a way. Some things can't be untangled cleanly. You just have to decide whether the entanglement is worth the cost of leaving it alone. They sat with that for a moment, the weight of it, the specific moral seriousness of choosing an action that would cause harm in order to prevent more harm, which was never a comfortable decision and never should be. Then Vane said, Ruth will hold the community together. She's done it before. Ruth will hold it together, Maggie agreed. And the children still need a school. That doesn't change regardless of where the money comes from. No, Vane said. It doesn't. She rode back to town in the full dark on the borrowed horse, and the stars were out, and the prairie was silent and enormous, and somewhere ahead the lights of Harlan Creek glowed small and warm against the darkness. She thought about Vane's face across the supper table, the slight loosening that had been building incrementally over 11 days, each honest conversation undoing another year's worth of careful distance, the way ice goes in spring. Not all at once, but in the places where the current runs warm first. She thought about the almost smile, how far it had come in 11 days from the absolute stillness of that first afternoon on Main Street. She didn't think beyond that yet. Some things needed to happen first, the story Cole, the town's reckoning with itself, the school. She was a woman who'd learned to sequence her hopes carefully to put them in the right order and not reach for the later ones before the earlier ones had landed. But she allowed herself in the dark and the silence of the prairie, with the horse moving steadily beneath her, to feel the shape of the later ones. It was enough for now. Sometimes the shape of a thing held carefully and without forcing was how you got it real. She came into town at the south end of Main Street and returned the horse to Pete's livery and walked to Mrs. Aldrich's in the cold night air, and she was unlocking her door when she heard footsteps behind her, quick, deliberate. She turned. It was Garrett. The farmer, broad-shouldered and windburned, standing in the lamplight outside the boarding house with his hat in his hands and an expression that said he'd been working himself up to this for a while. "Mrs. Callahan," he said, "I need to tell you something." His voice had the quality of a man choosing difficulty over comfort, which in Maggie's experience meant the thing he was about to say was true. "Come inside," she said. "I'll put the kettle on." Garrett sat at Mrs. Aldrich's kitchen table with both hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee, and the look of a man who'd made a decision that had cost him something to make. Mrs. Aldrich had gone to bed an hour ago, and the house was quiet except for the wind at the windows and the fire settling in the stove. "Cole came to see me this afternoon," Garrett said. "After he left Vane's property, he knew I'd been wavering on the school vote. Told me if I helped him reverse the board decision before the Chicago story ran, he'd guarantee the Creek Road funding, regardless of what happened with the railroad partnership." He paused. $2,000. County contract. Signed and delivered within the week. Maggie kept her hands around her own cup and her voice level. "What did you tell him?" "I told him I needed to think about it." Garrett looked at the table. "Which was true. I've got 3 children and a road that turns to mud 4 months a year and costs me a quarter of my grain yield every wet season. $2,000 is real money, Mrs. Callahan. I want you to understand I'm not a bad man. I'm just a man with problems that $2,000 solves." "I understand that," Maggie said, and she meant it. "But here's the thing." Garrett looked up. "When I was thinking about it this afternoon, I kept thinking about something you said at the board meeting, about what happens after 3 years when the railroad decides whether its own terms have been met." He set down the cup. "My father signed an arrangement like that with a grain broker in Ohio when I was 12 years old. 3-year contract, favorable terms, Broker held final assessment rights. End of year 3, the broker decided the terms hadn't been met on a technicality he'd written into the contract specifically so he could use it. We lost the farm. He was quiet for a moment. I swore I'd never put my family in that position again, and here I am 12 years later about to do exactly that with a railroad instead of a grain broker. Maggie didn't say anything. She waited because Garrett wasn't finished, and rushing him would be wrong. I'm not going to take Cole's offer, he said. I wanted you to know. And I wanted you to know that when the railroad funding disappears, and I understand it will, I'm not going to blame you for the Creek Road. I'm going to figure out another way. He picked up his hat from the table. I also wanted to say that I'm sorry it took me this long to see it clearly. You've been here 2 weeks, and you saw it on the first day. I saw it because I'd seen it before, Maggie said. Not because I'm smarter than you. Garrett nodded once, the nod of a man accepting something without making more of it than it needed to be. He stood and put his hat on. My boy Henry came home Saturday talking about bridges, he said at the door. He's been drawing plans all weekend. His mother thought he'd lost his mind. Maggie smiled. He hasn't. He's found it, actually. Garrett looked at her with the expression of a father encountering a version of his child he hadn't known existed. Then he walked out into the cold night, and Maggie sat alone in the kitchen for a long time, after thinking about all the different kinds of courage, the loud kind that everyone recognized, and the quiet kind that happened in kitchen tables and private decisions, and the moment when a man chose the harder right over the easier wrong with no audience at all. The Tribune story ran 11 days later. Carter Hayes had wired his editor from Abilene the morning after the confrontation at Vane's cabin, and the story had moved with the speed of something that had been ready for a long time and only needed the final piece. It ran on the front page of the Chicago Tribune on a Thursday morning and was picked up by the Kansas City Star, the Denver Post, and the St. Louis Republic within 48 hours. By the following Monday, it had reached New York. Maggie read it in Dobbins's office, standing at the compositing desk with the newspaper spread flat, and felt the particular sensation of watching something irreversible happen. Not triumph exactly, but the specific gravity of a thing that has been set in motion and will now go where it goes, regardless of anyone's wishes. The story named Consolidated's regional manager, the circuit judge, and 3 county officials across 2 territories. It named Cole by his full title, Councilman Preston. Cole, Harlan Creek, Kansas, local representative of Consolidated Railroad Company, and quoted the documentation with the specificity of a reporter who understood that precision was the difference between a story that survived legal challenge and one that didn't. It described Vane's testimony, his dismissal, the blacklisting, the 3 years of isolation, and the documentation he'd maintained through all of it with a fidelity that Hayes had called in print an act of civic conscience, sustained against every incentive to abandon it. Dobbins stood beside her and read it over her shoulder and said nothing for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice had the quality of a man setting down something heavy. I should have done this 2 years ago, he said. You did it now, Maggie said. That's what matters. Cole left Harlan Creek on the Friday the story ran, which was also the day a federal investigator arrived on the morning train. He left quietly without announcement in the early hours before the town was awake, which was in its own way a kind of answer to every question anyone might have asked him. His house on the north end of Main Street stood empty for 3 weeks before Ruth Haynes organized a town meeting to discuss what ought to be done with it. The town's reaction was not simple, because it never is. There was anger directed variously at Cole for the deception at Vane, for the disruption at Maggie for being the catalyst, and in some cases at Dobbins for running the story without warning anyone. Garrett bore some of it too. There were people who felt he should have taken the $2,000 and secured the Creek Road regardless of the larger principles, because the larger principles didn't fix a road that turned to mud and cost a quarter of the harvest every wet season. Ruth held the town meeting on a Tuesday evening in the church, which was the largest indoor space available, and it was loud and difficult, and went 2 hours longer than anyone had planned. Maggie sat in the third row with her hands folded in her lap and let people say what they needed to say, because that was what the meeting was for. Vane sat in the back near the door with the stillness he brought to everything difficult, not absent, not removed, but present in the way of someone who understands that some fires have to burn before they can be managed. Mrs. Aldrich stood up in the second hour and said with the directness of a woman who had survived the Civil War and was not impressed by council politics that she'd watched coal operate in this town for 4 years and had always known something was wrong with the arrangement and had never said so, and that the shame of that was hers to carry. She said she planned to carry it into a better set of decisions going forward, starting with the fact that they had a teacher and could fund a school without anyone else's money if they were willing to be resourceful about it. That shifted something in the room. Not completely, not immediately, but enough. Ruth called the vote at the end of the meeting on 3 questions: whether to proceed with the school rebuild using town funds, whether to pursue a legitimate state infrastructure grant for the Creek Road, and whether to formally request a federal review of all county contracts entered under Cole's representation. All 3 passed. The school vote was unanimous. The other 2 were close, but they passed. Vane drove the first wagon of lumber to the school site 2 weeks later. He did it early in the morning before most of the town was awake, which was characteristic. Pete from the livery was there, and Garrett and 2 other farmers whose names Maggie had been learning, and they worked without ceremony through the morning. When Maggie arrived at 8 with coffee and Henry Garrett in tow, she found the foundation framing already up and Vane on the roof of the adjacent framework with a hammer and the focused efficiency of a man who'd spent the first decade of his life learning to build things with his hands before the Pinkerton work had redirected him elsewhere. Henry Garrett stopped at the edge of the building site and looked up at the framing with an expression Maggie recognized, the same look he'd had when he'd gotten 10 problems right out of 12. Pure, undefended wonder. "The angle on that corner joint," Henry said. "That's not a standard right angle." Vane looked down from the roof. "It's a 5-degree offset. This site has a slight grade to the south. Standard right angle would put stress on the east wall in a heavy snow." He paused. "You noticed that?" Henry looked like someone had handed him something unexpected and precious. "My pa always said I had a head for spatial things. Couldn't figure out what to do with it." "Get up here," Vane said. "I'll show you how the offset distributes the load." Maggie watched Henry Garrett climb the ladder with the careful eagerness of a boy who has just been invited into the world he actually belongs in, and she felt something she had not allowed herself to feel in a long time. The specific, uncomplicated joy of watching a life find its direction. She turned away before it showed too much on her face and went to hand out the coffee. Dobbins found her at noon at the edge of the site, where she was reviewing the list of books she intended to request from the state education office. He had a letter in his hand, and the look of a man carrying good news that he hadn't yet decided how to present. "Federal investigator filed a preliminary report this morning," he said. "Circuit judge has been referred to a review panel. 2 of the county officials named in the story have already resigned." He paused. Consolidated's board in Chicago has issued a statement distancing themselves from the regional manager's actions. "They'll say he acted independently," Maggie said. "They already did." Hayes predicted that. He also predicted that the independent action defense won't hold once the investigator subpoenas the correspondence, because 3 of those letters were signed by a board member, not just the regional manager. Dobbins folded the letter carefully. "It's going to take a long time. Federal process is slow, but it's moving." "Good," Maggie said. She looked at the school framing. That's all it needed to do. Move. In the 4th week after the story ran, Delia Okafor came into Ruth's store on a Saturday morning and stood at the counter for a moment with the careful consideration of someone taking a measured step, and then she asked Ruth if she knew when the school was expected to be ready, because Ada had been asking every day, and Delia wanted to give her an accurate answer. Ruth said March if the weather held. Delia nodded. Then she said, Tell Mr. Vane that Jonas and I appreciate what he did with the survey. We've been meaning to say it for a while." Ruth said she'd pass it along. Delia started toward the door, and then stopped, and turned back and looked at Maggie, who was at the back table with Ada and Henry, working through long division. She looked at the children bent over their slates with the particular focused intensity of children who've discovered they're capable of more than they thought. And something moved through Delia's face, not quite released, not yet, but moving in that direction, like a fist slowly opening. "Thank you, Mrs. Callahan," she said, "for Ada." "Thank Ada," Maggie said. "She does the work. I just show her where the door is." Delia almost smiled. Then she went out, and the bell above the door rang once and fell silent. Vane came to town more regularly now. Not every day, but enough that it stopped being notable, which was Maggie thought its own kind of progress. He helped with the school construction on Tuesdays and Thursdays and sometimes Saturdays, and people talked to him the way they were beginning to talk to him, which was still sometimes careful, but increasingly like the way you talk to someone you've decided to know. Pete invited him to supper once and reported back to Maggie with some satisfaction that Vane had eaten 2 plates of stew and told exactly one story from his Pinkerton years about a missing horse in Wyoming that had turned out not to be missing at all, which had been, Pete said, genuinely funny. Maggie filed this away with the other small evidences she'd been accumulating. The almost smiles the way he'd started arriving at the school site with coffee already made and a cup set out beside his without being asked the afternoon 3 weeks ago, when Henry Garrett had solved a load distribution problem on the roof framing, and Vane had said, "Good work," in the same tone he used for everything, and Henry had nearly fallen off the roof from the shock of it. She filed all of it, and she waited because she was learning slowly, imperfectly, but learning to put things in their right order. He found her alone at the school site on a Thursday evening in late February, when everyone else had gone home and she'd stayed to measure the window spaces against the list of glass she'd ordered from the supply catalog. The school was almost complete. Another 2 weeks, Ruth said. The stove was already installed. The floor was laid. She'd been choosing books for 3 weeks from a state list and a personal list she'd been building in her head since she was 22 years old, and first understood what a good school could do to a child's understanding of what was possible. Vane came up beside her and looked at the window frame she was measuring and said, "The glass arrives Friday." "I know," Maggie said. "I wanted to check the measurements before it came. I have a tendency to assume things are the right size and find out too late that they're not." "Generally a useful instinct to correct," he said. "I'm working on it." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the February light was going the particular pale gold of late winter, the angle that means spring is coming, even if the cold hasn't agreed yet. The framing threw long shadows across the new floor, and the whole structure smelled of cut pine and sawdust and possibility. "I want to say something," Vane said. Maggie set down the measuring tape and turned to face him. He looked for a moment like a man standing at the edge of something he'd been working up to for a long time, and had decided he wasn't going to put off any further. His jaw had the set to it, she knew, but underneath it something was different, not the pressurized containment of a man managing anger or wariness, but the tension of a man preparing to say something true that mattered. "When you rode out to my property that first Sunday," he said, "I told myself it was a practical situation. You were trying to help Dobbins find a venue. I was trying to find a venue. The interests aligned." He paused. "That was accurate. It was also incomplete." "I know," Maggie said. He looked at her. "I've known for a while," she said. "I've been waiting for you to know it too." Something crossed his face. Surprise, and then the releasing of something held a long time, and then the particular expression of a man who has been met honestly and doesn't know quite what to do with the relief of it. "I don't do this well," he said. "Talking about this. I spent 3 years not needing to do it, and before that I was working most of the time, and before that—" He stopped. "I'm not explaining this well." "You're doing fine," Maggie said. "I'm not a simple situation," he said. "There are still federal proceedings. The railroad will fight the investigation. It could be 2 years before anything is fully resolved, and in the meantime, I'm still the man the county is looking at as the primary witness, which means—" "Elias," Maggie said. He stopped. She'd used his first name without planning to, and it landed in the room between them with a weight that the simple word carried only when it was said at exactly the right moment. She saw it land. She saw what it did to his face, the way 2 years' worth of careful distance dissolved in a single syllable, not dramatically, not with any performance attached, just quietly and completely, the way ice goes when the season finally turns. "I buried my husband in frozen ground 7 months ago," she said. "I arrived in this town with 43 cents and a letter of introduction. I have made a powerful enemy, disrupted the county's political arrangement, and taken a teaching position that doesn't begin for 2 more weeks." She looked at him steadily, the way she looked at everything she'd decided to look at clearly. "I am not frightened of a complicated situation. I am, in fact, apparently drawn to them." The corner of his mouth moved, further than before, all the way this time. It was a real smile. Small, still he was not a man built for large expressions, but completely genuine. The kind that reaches the eyes and stays there. The kind that looks like something that has been waiting a long time to be allowed out. "You are possibly the most direct person I have ever met," he said. "I've been told that," Maggie said. "Usually by people who mean it as a complaint." "I don't mean it as a complaint." "I know," she said. He reached out and took her hand. Not with ceremony. Not with the careful impersonality of the practical gestures before helping her on and off a horse, the matter-of-fact business of working alongside each other. This was deliberate. This was a choice made consciously and without ambiguity, the kind of choice that means something specific and knows it does. Maggie looked at his hand around hers, calloused, scarred along the knuckles. The hands of someone who'd spent 35 years doing difficult work in difficult conditions, and felt something settle in her chest that she hadn't felt in a very long time. Not the desperate relief of the early weeks, not the careful optimism of the planning and the scheming and the staying one step ahead of Cole. Something quieter than all of that. Something that felt like ground underfoot after a long time of not being entirely sure where you were standing. "I'd like to come to the school opening," Vane said, "when it happens." "I'd like you to," Maggie said. "And after that," he said, "I'd like to find out what comes next, methodically, without rushing." "Methodically," Maggie said. "I think I can manage that." He looked at her with the dark, steady eyes she'd read 100 different things in over the past weeks. Assessment recognition, the careful intelligence of a man who trusted his own judgment about people only after it had been tested. What was in them now was none of those things. It was simpler and deeper both. "You changed things here," he said. "Not just the school and the railroad, the way people look at each other. Garrett's been talking to the Okafor family about the water access problem. Mrs. Aldrich apologized to Ruth last week for something that apparently happened in 1881 that everyone thought was forgotten. Dobbins has been writing again, real writing, not just notices and commerce reports." He paused. "I don't think you entirely understand what you did." "I pointed people at things they already wanted to do," Maggie said. "That's what a teacher does. The wanting was already there." "The wanting was there," Vane agreed. "But wanting isn't enough on its own. You need someone who can show you that the thing is possible." He looked at her. "You did that." Maggie thought about Thomas one last time, not with grief, not with the acute missing that had been her constant companion for 7 months, but with the gentle completeness of someone who has been loved well and knows it and carries it forward as a gift rather than a weight. She thought about what he would have said about Harlan Creek, about the school, about the man standing beside her with her hand in his, and a real smile that had taken 11 weeks and a federal investigation to arrive at. He would have said, "Well, Maggie, you found the interesting part again." He would have been right. The school opened on the 14th of March, on a morning so clear and cold that the sky looked like someone had stretched blue silk over the world, Every child in the county whose parents could get them there arrived before 8 o'clock, and several of them had walked 3 miles in the dark to do it. Ada Okafor sat in the front row with her slate held precisely horizontal and her expression one of fierce, barely contained readiness. Henry Garrett sat beside her and was already drawing angles in the margin of his paper before Maggie had finished calling the roll. The whole town came for the first hour. Ruth stood in the back with her arms folded and her face the careful neutral of a woman not going to show what she was feeling. Pete brought his 2 youngest and stood by the door with his hat in his hands. Dobbins came with his notebook out of professional habit and didn't write anything in it because there are some things that don't need to be recorded to be real. Delia and Jonas. Okafor stood together near the window, Jonas's hand on Delia's shoulder, watching Ada's face with the particular expression of parents witnessing a child receive something they'd fought to give her. Vane stood at the back next to the window in the good coat he'd worn to the town meeting. He looked at the children at their desks, with the expression of a man seeing something he'd helped build being used for its intended purpose. He looked at Maggie. She was standing at the front of the room with 23 children and the particular quality of stillness that came over her when she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Not performing readiness, not managing nervousness, just present and certain and prepared. She looked back at him. Something passed between them in that look that needed no words, had no words, was not the kind of thing that words improved. Acknowledgement. Recognition. The specific gravity of 2 people who'd been through something real together and knew it, and were standing on the other side of it looking forward. She turned back to the class. "Good morning," she said. "My name is Mrs. Callahan. This is your school, which means it belongs to you, and what you make of it is your responsibility. We're going to start with what you know, and we're going to build from there, and I promise you, every single one of you, that what you're capable of is larger than what you've been told." She picked up the chalk. "Now, let's find out how large." 23 slates came up in unison. Outside, the Kansas winter light was already beginning its slow turn toward spring. The creek road ran straight and rutted toward the horizon, waiting as roads do for the work that would come. 40 acres up that road, a lamp burned in a cabin window where 300 pages of truth had once been stored against a justice that had finally arrived. And in a one-room schoolhouse in Harlan Creek, Kansas, in the clear, cold morning of the 14th of March, 1883, a widow with 43 cents and a letter of introduction stood at a chalkboard and taught the first lesson of the rest of her life. Some people arrive in a place with nothing and build everything. Some people wait years for the right door and find it was never locked, only stuck. And some people, the fortunate ones, the ones who recognize each other across crowded streets and difficult circumstances, find that the home they'd been looking for was never a place at all. It was always a choice. Made once in desperation. Made again in clarity. Made every morning after that, in the ordinary and extraordinary accumulation of a life built together on ground that finally truly belonged to them both.